What I'd like to do is to take a few minutes to provide you with the facts about where we've been, where we are, and where the U.S. is headed, both financially and fiscally. This chart represents federal spending adjusted for inflation since 1912. In 1912, the U.S. government was 2% of the U.S. economy. Last year, it was 23% of the economy. So the federal government is almost 12 times bigger today as a percentage of the economy than it was in 1912. And revenues have not kept up with expenses, especially recently. This shows years with Republican presidents in red and Democratic presidents in blue. As you can see, spending is a bipartisan problem, and it's been particularly out of control since 2003. Since 2003, we've had presidents from both major political parties, and the Congress has been controlled by both major political parties. The truth is, there's not a party of fiscal responsibility. There are people who are, there's just not enough of them. This is how we spent money last year in Washington, D.C. Number one is Social Security, including retirement, disability, and survivor's insurance. Number two is health care cost for Medicare and Medicaid. And number three is national defense. Note that, contrary to popular belief, international and foreign affairs was only about 1.5% of the budget. In 1912, the Congress controlled 97% of federal spending. The only thing that it did not control was interest expense. Last year, it only controlled 36%. Of that part, which the so-called sequester is forcing downward, it includes all of the express and enumerated responsibilities of the federal government under the Constitution, all investments in our future, and all investments in young people. That approach is not a prescription for prosperity. If you use honest and comparable accounting to compare us to Europe, you would add federal, state, and local debt as a percentage of the economy. By doing so, you will find there is only one country in Europe that has a higher percentage of debt to GDP than us today, and that's Greece. And we don't want to follow Greece's lead. So who owns our public debt? China and Japan are the largest foreign holders, together with OPEC nations, but the largest single holder is the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve purchased about 80% of new U.S. debt in 2011 and over a third of new debt in 2012. The Federal Reserve is also the only major player purchasing long-term U.S. debt. Stated differently, we are self-dealing in our own debt. And for every 1% future increase in interest rates on federal debt, interest costs will go up over $160 billion a year. And what do you get for interest? As we say in the South, shinola, nothing. Now, you're probably familiar with the national debt clock. It's currently over $16 trillion, up from $5.6 trillion in 2000. But it lowballs the problem. When you consider unfunded civilian and military pensions and retiree health care, unfunded Social Security and Medicare promises, and various other commitments and contingencies, and these numbers are all there in the official financial statements of the U.S. government. And when you then use a simple principle called math, in the year 2000, the federal sinkhole totaled $20.4 trillion. At the end of last year, it was up to about $70 trillion and going up about 8.2 million a minute, 14.4 billion a day, $80 billion a week, and over $4 trillion a year. So the problem is a lot bigger than the politicians admit. The sinkhole is getting deeper very rapidly by doing nothing, and Washington has become very adept at doing nothing. Hopefully, this will give us a greater sense of urgency to act, even more than the national debt clock. Importantly, this $70 trillion number could be reduced by tens of trillions of dollars, even if the reforms are phased in over time, because it's a discounted present value of future cash flows. Therefore, the sooner we make real changes, the better. But what if we don't act? This is what the future looks like for our annual budget if we go back to taxing at historical levels of 18% of our economy, which we're expected to return to by 2014, if we don't reform Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, if we charge the difference to the credit card, and if interest rates don't go out of sight. The fastest growing expense? Interest, for which we get Shinola. The second fastest growing expense is health care, which we have to do something about or we can't solve the problem. And the longer we wait, the worse the problem gets. So it's prudent to act sooner rather than later because time is working against us. If we don't fix these problems, here's what happens to debt as a percentage of the economy. Only one time in the history of the United States have we had public debt over 100% of the economy, and that was World War II. But we got something for World War II. We defeated the Axis powers, we saved the free world, and after World War II, we were over 50% of the global economy, the dollar was as good as gold, and we had 16 persons working for every person retired on Social Security. The U.S. grew dramatically, and we did not pay off a dime of debt, but public debt as a percentage of the economy went down to 26.1% in 1980. But we lost financial control in 2003, and now we're headed for third world nation status on debt as a percentage of the economy if we don't change direction pretty quick. But reducing debt as a percentage of our economy will be harder to do than after World War II. Not only is spending higher than tax revenues now, but spending on government retirement programs are clearly going to grow. Medicare Part A, the hospital insurance program, has been adding to deficits for a number of years in a row now. Social Security didn't add a dime to the deficit in recent years until 2010, but now is increasingly paying out more than it takes in. And the cash flow deficits from both these programs are going to grow rapidly in the coming years. Why? Because there are 10,000 people a day eligible to retire on Social Security and Medicare. They're the so-called baby boomers, and I'm one of them. And eventually, I'll be eligible. 10,000 new retirees a day for the next 17 years means that government will have to start paying more benefits, but as people exit the workforce, the government will get less revenue. So it's a double whammy that has to be dealt with. A lot of people think that they've paid for their Medicare benefits because we pay payroll taxes for Part A, hospital insurance, and once we retire, we pay premiums for Part D and Part B. The truth is, the typical person gets 315% return on their Medicare payroll taxes and premiums, in part because 95% of people who voluntarily sign up for Medicare's Part B and D, which are outpatient, physician, and prescription drugs, get a 75% taxpayer subsidy irrespective of their income and wealth. So we are subsidizing people who are very well off. And on health care, we spend over double per person what other industrialized countries spend, and we get below average results on life expectancy, on obesity, and a variety of other societal measures. When you spend double per person, but you get below average results, the answer is not to throw more money at that system. The answer is to reform the system, dealing with incentives, transparency, and accountability. And by the way, we have the same problem with K through 12 education. We spend double per person and we get below average societal results. Now what about defense? We spend as much as the next roughly 20 nations combined on defense, and most of those are allies. What about tax burdens? People argue that we're an overtaxed society. I guess that depends on where you sit. But the fact is, if you look at federal, state, and local taxes as a percentage of the economy, we're lower than most major industrialized nations. Only Japan and Mexico are lower than we are. If you look at the tax code, we lose over $1 trillion a year to deductions, exemptions, credits, and exclusions. Number one on the list of special tax preferences for individuals is that people don't pay income tax on employer-provided and paid health care. Number two, the mortgage interest deduction. Number three, the fact that until this year, people who made all their income on dividends and capital gains, very wealthy people like Warren Buffett, paid only 15% on that income, and they don't pay payroll taxes on that income either. The Earned Income Tax Credit gives a rebate to the working poor, which not only reduces their taxes, but in many cases it gives them a subsidy check. 20% of Americans get a rebate for more than they paid in income taxes. And then charitable contributions are number 5. We have 2 problems on income taxes. Now this is just income taxes. As you know, over 60% of Americans pay more in payroll taxes than in income taxes. Over 40% of people who file tax returns at the federal level pay zippo in income tax, and about 20% get absolute rebates. Now obviously, to the extent that you have a certain level of income that's some function of the poverty level, you can justify their not having to pay income taxes because they are paying other taxes, like payroll taxes. At the same point in time, when income taxes fund all, or substantially all, of the constitutional roles of the federal government, it is a dangerous disconnect to have over 40% not paying any income tax. On the other hand, at the top, the people making over $1 million a year, they're estimated to have an effective income tax rate of under 21% in 2012. You say, how can that be? The top tax rate is 39%. That's because they paid only 15% for dividend and long-term capital gains, which has now been raised to 20% for many people and about 23.8% for people with very high investment income. So the truth is, we have to get more people paying something under a more progressive tax system. But we also have to limit special tax preferences for the well-off, but how you do that matters. I would respectfully suggest that you don't want to build on our current complex, non-competitive, and inadequate tax system. We need comprehensive tax reform that makes the system fair, more competitive, and raises more revenue. And in closing, this is not just a financial issue. This is not just an economic issue. This is an ethical and a moral issue. These are my 3 grandkids and my wife. We are mortgaging the future of our kids and grandkids at record rates, and we are reducing relative investments in their future at a time when they're going to face a lot tougher competition in an increasingly interconnected and interdependent global marketplace. That is irresponsible. That is unethical. That is immoral, and it must stop. My grandkids are 7, 10, and 11, so they obviously don't have a vote. They don't have a voice. I am their voice. We can, we must, and I hope that we will come together to solve this problem in an equitable way. Let's work together to do it this year.